Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Professor of Organic Chemistry, Dr. Dave Collum, who teaches at Cornell. Dr. Collum is well known outside of his profession for his thoughts on everything from the economy and investing to politics and the meaning of life. He produces a very popular annual year in review and is featured on many media outlets. Dr. Collum, how is 2021 and the new abnormal treating you?
As to be expected, I guess is a good answer. It's still rough. Still rough.
All right. Yeah, same here for me. I wanted to get your big picture view of what's going on in the economy, politics, and the culture as well. I feel we're witnessing a collapse of not just the economy, but a breakdown in society and culture and the disintegration of democracy and our political systems. And since you speak a lot about the economy, I guess we could start there. I think you've been bearish on the economy since like forever, and with good reason, because everything seems to be manipulated. The Fed, Wall Street, precious metals, and so on. Everything seems to be in a bubble. Money printing has gone full Zimbabwe. I've got my Zimbabwe note here. And I'm wondering if someday the US dollar will get to, we'll get $1 million US note, or even perhaps $1 trillion US note. But John Rubino from Dollar Collapse, who's been a frequent guest on this podcast, recently posted a great article saying that we're in the middle of a worldwide sovereign debt bubble collapse that no one alive today has witnessed and that hasn't happened in a century. So kind of, where are we? We're in the eye of the storm. What's going on with the economy today?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with John 100% on the middle part. I think we're at the very front edge of it. Maybe even, the pregame warm up where we're, taking a knee on the national anthem or something. I think the economy's been pretty lousy for many years now. And people, it's too easy to, first of all, watch TV and have someone tell you it's okay and then say, well, it must be okay when it's not. It's too easy to look at the stock market and say, well, the stocks are all going up, so we must be creating all sorts of wealth. And that turns out not to be true. Over the last decade, where the GDP grew optimistically 30%, the equity markets went up something like 300%. And they, over the long term, track each other because the stock market is supposed to reflect growth in the GDP, right? Those are the 500 biggest companies, the S&P. It ought to follow it. And it simply is not. So the financialization of the system has caused the price of everything to get distorted, all the way from used cars to lumber to you name it. Everything's a speculative play toy now. Bitcoin, gold, whatever you want. They're all at the mercy of money flows, not supply demand.
Yeah, just since I brought up the Fed, I have here my and the Fed coffee cup. And you were, I think, this week on George Gammon's podcast, who's great, and I think he's trying to sue the Fed. You think anything's going to happen there? No,
that's a safe statement. I'll bet any amount of money. You want to speculate? We can start today. I'll bet no. My conversation with George was fun. George has this interesting ability to keep things super simple, and such that then when you get to the end, you go, wow, how could that not be true? The way he just told us. And so he just, I just watched a podcast of his the other day where he explained why stimulus money inhibits the economy. And it wasn't just by baiting us not to work, but a much more deep-seated problem. And I thought he did a very good job. So George is a good educator about basic free market principles. And we're in trouble.
Yeah, and I guess speaking of trouble, I want to get your thought, on the fallout of kind of what's coming. We're seeing the middle class being wiped out globally. I think this is intentional because we see collusion between big tech, big money, big pharma, big government. They're shutting down mom and pop. Well, big box stores are, we've got so many new, billionaires. All that money has gone to the top. I was living in Kazakhstan for a while, and over there they've been saying, if another lockdown comes, the Kazakh middle class is permanently wiped out. I'm now currently here in Mexico, and all around the place, I'm seeing storefronts with for rent signs all over everywhere. 53% of Canadians are $200 away from not being able to pay bills. I had a recent interview with Mark Faber, the renowned investor who said, a number of his friends in Switzerland lost their high-paying jobs, and he doesn't think they're ever going to get those jobs again, or perhaps never even find employment at their age. So I have a feeling 2022 is going to start looking like 1932. So, how much longer can we keep papering things over? And you're saying we're at the tail end, when things are going to start unraveling. Some of my previous guests, like Dmitry Orlov, predicts a Soviet-style collapse in the U.S. Others, like Finnish economist Tuomas Malinen, predict the same, but he thinks we can recover in 3 to 5 years. When things start to unravel, what's that going to look like?
I've through the years figured out that if you're making predictions that are 3 standard deviations off the bell curve, you're asking to be wrong. So if you make one of those, you better have really stared at the problem. Usually things are not as apocalyptic as you think. I'm reminded of the Gulf oil spill when it looked like we'd open the gates of hell and we would just pollute the oceans from oil spews and then they plugged it, and you look up, and within a year or so, the Gulf seemed to be doing okay, and they were shrimping again. And so you got to remind yourself that everything passes. World War II passed, the Great Depression passed, and so total doomsday scenarios are generally wrong, just statistically. With that said, I think moderate doomsday scenarios look pretty probable to me. I think that looks like the center of my bell curve. So I agree with that. When and how it plays out, the one thing that makes it so confounding now is at one point in time, you could formulate a reasonably well-founded opinion that you could anticipate central bank response. And so if you saw a recession coming, you'd say, here's what'll happen. We'll go into a recession. The Feds will cut rates, things like that. We'll pull out of the recession. There's almost never any evidence that the Fed cutting rates pulled us out of the recession. So if every time you go into a recession, they cut rates, every time you pull out, I mean, that's like my dog. My dog waiting for me to come home at night. And every time the dog sits at the door, I come home. And the dog thinks it's causality. And the dog doesn't realize that, no, I just come home. So recoveries just occur. And the Fed can pretend like, their rate cuts did it, but they'd occur anyways. And some argue much, much faster. So the problem we have now is that it's clear that the Fed has convinced itself and convinced a lot of people that there's no cap to what you can do to intervene. And so interventions in the past were basically just rates. And then when they bailed out Bear Stearns for $30 billion. It kind of sucked the oxygen out of the room. And you go, oh my God, I can't believe they just pumped $30 billion into the system for Bear Stearns. And what no one saw coming, no one in the known universe of mine saw coming within a decimal point, maybe 2 decimal points, central banks putting 20 trillion into the system. And now we've done that. We've done it again. And nothing has blown up. And so I think the Feds now are unmoored. I think they have this view that there is no limit to what they can do. There are no natural barriers to what they can do. And as a consequence, we're now at great risk because they suffer from their own moral hazard. They think they're omnipotent.
And speaking about all this, money printing, looking at the effects of that, I'm seeing reported around the world in many countries, for example, in Nigeria, food inflation hit its highest in 15 years. Now it's 22%. Inflation, it's pretty high everywhere. I'm noticing prices rise, and I guess that's one effect of what they're doing. What are your thoughts on inflation and other such outcomes measures?
Inflation never helps the little guy. It's a guarantee. And the notion that a little bit of inflation stimulates the economy is a Fed concocted lie. You can actually, George made a good case for that the other day, where you can show how stupid that is. It makes no sense whatsoever. There's one. I asked Twitter one day and got quite a few people chiming in from the higher levels of financial Twitter. And I said, give me some evidence that inflation promotes the economy? And the answers were all stupid. They're all things like, well, if you know something's going to be cheaper next year, you won't buy it. And I go, what would that be? You won't buy a car, you won't buy a phone, you won't buy food, you won't buy healthcare. What part of that is true? And the answer is, there's only one answer, and the answer is assets. You might not buy assets. And that's the only thing that bothers the hell out of central bankers, is that you won't buy assets if you know they're going to be cheaper. But even then, if you know that the assets will be worth more because we're in a deflationary situation and they'll retain value, you'd even buy those. And so that's fiction. There was one argument that someone made out of what seemed like hundreds, where they said there's a difference in response to employment if you inflate away the cost of employees, where the cost of employees, if you hold their income fixed while inflation runs, then they are taking pay cuts, and the wages are sticky. If we have a deflationary situation, it's hard to pay someone less and less, and so that kind of gets you stuck. It's the stickiness of wages. Whereas if you can inflate away the cost of employment while not give the employees benefits, not giving them pay raises, which, look at the stats on sort of average Joe employment, they're not getting paid well at all. They've lost huge ground. So in that sense, it's working. Then that in theory could be the alternative, where you say when the employees become too expensive, you lay them off. And so and you can't give them pay cuts because it doesn't work. And so you lay them off. And so there's a little bit of resonance there for me, but it's not a compelling argument, but it's not as crazy as the rest of the garbage that economists put out there.
And speaking of inflation, what about hyperinflation? There's this talk, continued talk about the dollar, its reserve status. Now I think it's at 60% being used around the world, and that's declining. And this talk of China's petro gold yuan, and just in general, the decline of the dollar. I think someone said in this last year it's lost 10% of its purchasing power. In general, what's your thought on the dollar?
Well, there's to me, first and foremost, the notion of inflation and deflation is a little stupefying in that if I were to say describe the weather as sunny or rainy, that's an inadequate binary choice I'm forcing you to make. You could say hot or cold. It's still an inadequate choice. The weather requires an enormous amount of descriptors. And so to talk about inflation versus deflation is artificially stiffening up the debate. So let's go with that. But let's stay with that binary choice. You go from deflation to no inflation to mild to serious inflation to hyperinflation. For me, the discontinuity is between high inflation and hyperinflation. I think hyperinflation occurs when you have what, for want of a better term, is you have a failed state. So you can have high inflation, everything can still be working, everything function. I think when you shoot into the hyperinflation mode, I can't remember, something like 40% a year or something. Is that the definition? These are arbitrary definitions. Why do I care? When you reach hyperinflation, it means that there's a real loss in faith, not just inflation expectations, but a loss in faith in the system. And so I'm not as worried about hyperinflation because I think we're not likely to go there. Although geopolitically and socially in this country, I could change my mind on that pretty fast too. But the high inflation, 70s stagflation, stuff like that seems exceedingly probable to me. Mm-hmm. So that could get very unpleasant.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And shooting over to gold and silver to get your thoughts. People hodl Bitcoin. I like to hodl gold and silver. And if it seems both are poised to rise in the near future because, as you did mention, the geopolitical situation, it seems central banks are buying gold like crazy, especially in the East, Russia and China. And it seems silver is getting ready to rumble. Just what's your take on the precious metals?
Well, so I've been a gold silver bug since 99. And for 2 painful years, while gold and silver drifted down, not up, from 99 to 2001. And during part of those 2 years, the NASDAQ, everything was roaring. So I felt like a complete idiot. because I had bailed from equities and jumped into gold and silver and a lot of cash, a lot of stuff like that. And for about the next 15, I also jumped into energy, which looked real good until eventually it made me suffer. And then gold seems to be sort of sputtering along, looking like I agree, like it could take off. I'm most intrigued by silver. I did a podcast with the Wall Street silver guys. And these are the guys who not only are silver bugs of a higher order, but they're also the guys who are trying to trigger a short squeeze. So they're at the hub of that silver squeeze movement. And what I observed from the outside looking in was that they tried to trigger a squeeze almost to the day that the squeeze was said to commence. Right? They were trying to do it like we all rise up and pick up our guns and shoot people or something. Silver went down, and it sort of just kept getting bombed every day, and it just trickled down. It wasn't horrible. Down, I gave up 6 months of gains, maybe. I even had the sense that maybe the system, which can use, the futures market to dork with it, that maybe the commodities traders at the big banks said, let's make sure we show these loser retail guys that this is a dangerous game they're playing. And so they might have drawn a line in the sand and said, let's not let them get their squeeze. And so if they go in the futures market and start selling silver, say, oh, that was a bad idea, never mind. I talked to them about it, and they said, actually, it's working. It's not showing up in the price, but they talked about it. And I knew there was rumors of shortages, short supplies, stuff like that. But they said the supplies are suffocatingly short. And so the big silver brokers like Apemex, is that how you pronounce it? I never know how to pronounce Apemex, APMEX. He said there's people claiming they haven't gotten their delivery in 2 months. And so they're having trouble sourcing it, the big suppliers. At some point, the futures market just parts ways from the physical market. And we talked even about that. And I said, well, the futures market will pay off in cash. That's apparently written into the prospectus, is kind of a force majeure clause that says if we have to, we'll give you cash equivalent, which means, therefore, if there's a shortage, they just can't deal with. And they said, yeah, but in other commodity squeezes that have occurred like that, that particular futures market collapsed within the year. And so that's a kind of a suicide move to default by using cash. I'm getting interested in the idea of going longer silver. I probably have 2 annual salaries worth of silver, so which is quite a bit. But I'm thinking of going longer for 2 reasons. One is because it's good precious metal bet. And everything's a bet now. At this point, cash is a bet. Everything's a goddamn bet. And it's down deep in my brain, and I'm going, and if they can squeeze this thing, and if they can get it going crazy, and if they can do what it did with lumber and what it did with plywood and what it did with I think it was palladium, one of them took off, and I'll own it. And then what I would be doing is, if I'd be believing that it won't last, I wouldn't believe it as evidence of hyperinflation, but rather evidence that that the silver bugs pulled it off. I'd be selling into it pretty steadily, trying to capture 2, 3, 4-fold gains, and potentially rolling it over to gold, providing gold doesn't track it, because gold's a bigger market. So if silver takes off, leaving gold behind, I'd have one finger over the sell key, and I'd move it to gold. And in the worst case scenario, I get cleaned out of my silver position. I still have gold, and so I'm not sitting in cash. And then presumably someone will pound it back down, and then I'll get back into my silver position. And who knows? That's how I'm thinking about it. It would be nice to get one of these stupid maniacal 4 or 5-fold gains, and that's not why I buy it, but it's that lotto ticket, right?
Yeah. Speaking of shortages, I'm supposed to be speaking soon to a great Mexican economist who's been writing about how here in Mexico, The central bank hasn't replenished its store of gold in over 15 months, and that none of the commercial banks where you buy gold, they're out of gold, so they have to get it from the central bank. And
so gold's thin too, then.
Yeah, here in Mexico, and he's also talking about silver.
Who is this?
It's Guillermo Barba. He's off on
okay. I know the name.
Yeah, and he also said that Mexico's the number 1-2 producer of silver, and so he's talking about there being shortages as well. So that's going on. Just your quick thought on Bitcoin and crypto. I think the technology is cool, but I'm personally kind of wary of it. Smart people like Max Kaiser, Michael Saylor say it's going to the moon. Which I can see at least in the short term. Others like other smart people like Jim Rogers, who's been on this podcast, and Ray Dalio, warning that Bitcoin can be outlawed, regulated, or taxed. What's your take on Bitcoin and cryptos?
Well, Max is one of the few older, real diehard hodlers. I know at one point Max had 10,000 Bitcoin at $5 a piece. That means that if he didn't buy any more, and he's been hooting about cryptos ever since, but if he didn't buy any more, he's worth $500 million. So as I said to Max and Stacy one day in a podcast, I said, you guys are not having trouble paying your mortgage now, is my guess. Crypto is past the point of it being just a speculative toy, and it's now at the point where it's going to be some sort of epic showdown. And my bet is that the sovereign states will find a way to deal with it. But I also think the retail guys don't understand it. I think they're serious, very bullish hodlers who do understand it. So it's not to say it's only dumb retail guys who are bullish. But I think the serious players know that the state is a risk, and they know that it could drop like a stone. It could drop 80% and then rally back, 2,000%. The retail crowd, the fist pumpers, I call them, think that the state can't touch them, which I think is preposterous, and think that it can't go down even. And that's equally preposterous. And so I think that crowd is going to get sobered up fast. They're going to learn about what my definition of a correction is. My definition of a correction is that you have to check two boxes. And if you look at the equity market, we haven't had one in 10 years by this definition. But the two boxes you have to check are, one has to be a significant price adjustment downward. And so you really have to take the froth off. And the second requirement is that you have to adjust investors' attitudes. So they have to go through an attitude adjustment. They have to talk to God a few times during it. And we have not had that since 2008, 2009. Now people say, well, what about March? I go, what did you learn from March? You learned from March that if you just hang on within March, you'll be good. So you learned the wrong lesson. So that's not a correction. That's an anti-correction. That's a moral hazard enhancement move. And 2018, same thing. So the retail investors have been taught, no matter what you do, don't sell, and the market always goes up. Mm-hmm. And unlike any other bubble in history, they don't pretend that the economy's roaring. They just assume the Fed will never hurt them. And evidence to the contrary is out there. So I think they're nuts.
Now, I don't know if you've been following this other aspect as closely of this idea of a cashless society and central bank digital currencies, which seems to be like, the government's version of crypto, their own crypto, where they're saying now 9 out of 10 countries in the world are now looking to implement these central bank digital currencies, getting rid of cash, which I guess it looks like it would be an answer to this, whatever kind of crash is coming. The CBDCs would be kind of their answer to this. But then there's this danger of this dystopian Chinese-style social credit system. What are your thoughts on this talk of CBDCs and if they can be implemented and any threat that they pose?
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of misnomer here. There are theories out there as to what Bitcoin is. There's some people who think that Bitcoin was actually derived from sovereign states, and they're using it as a beta test to get us all acclimated to crypto so that they can go cashless. They came out of Davos about 8 years ago. Davos disbanded, and all the major leaders came back and were spouting off about a cashless society. So it was clear that the talking point was cashless. And if you read articles about it, they would, of course, do the usual thing about how cash is the currency of scoundrels and crooks and thieves and pedophiles and this and that. And around 5 or 6 paragraphs in any article, they would also say, oh, and by the way, it would make monetary policy easier. What that means is that they could drop rates on bank accounts negative. And if you're in a cashless society, there is no escape. You own whatever cash you have in the system is going to get eroded by negative interest rates. And so you should fight a cashless society with tooth and nail. Cashless should be something you'd be willing to arm yourself against. This should be Tree of Liberty fertilization time. Rogoff published articles about it. I challenged him one day and he said, read my book. I read his book. He's a total globalist. He thinks that everything should just be done globally and that cashless society is good. And he thinks the central bank should have the power to go negative interest rates. I go, you're an idiot. I just don't believe that there's anything sane about that unless your goal is to screw up the world or dominate the world or some variant of that. So I oppose that. Now, any sovereign currency is not going to be a cryptocurrency. It might somehow use the blockchain, but it's going to be theirs, not yours. It's not going to be decentralized. It's not going to be in the control of Joe Sixpack. It's going to be in the control of the sovereigns. And so to call various sovereign currencies crypto, what you're really getting is this that makes it sound appealing to people who like crypto. But it's just digital currency. That's all it is. It's digital currency, maybe using blockchain to track it, but they want to track your ass. They don't want to give you the power of being able to transfer stuff to your buddies without them knowing it, right? They want to control it. They probably already know it. So I don't think it's as secret as people think anyways. So I'm not a Bitcoin fan at this point.
I'm kind of agreeing with your assessment. I want to get your thoughts then, moving to the political and geopolitical. Some listeners might not be happy with my view, although I'm seeing now people on the left also agree with me that the Biden administration is beginning to resemble the film Idiocracy. They're working. They're working actively to start World War III. They've opened the borders and flooding America with migrants. A former podcast guest of mine, Alex Krainer, a hedge fund manager, fellow Croatian like myself, former soldier, he pointed out that migration is a weapon of war to bring down nations. The Biden admin is, messing with the Supreme Court. I think in the House or wherever today, they just passed Washington, D.C. as making it the 51st state. They're getting rid of police. I mean, it's just kind of nuts. And so, how does your organic chemistry brain decipher the political situation?
Well, so every administration sort of has their calling. As soon as 9/11 occurred, Bush announced that it was a war on terror would define his administration, unfortunately. It was clear when Obama entered office, the economy had to be it, right? Because he entered in the middle of a deep recession. And Trump was to get certain sort of freedoms back and to straighten out relationships with China that were pretty distorted. And so I wrote fairly favorable about the Biden administration, not because I thought they're any good, because I was stunned. If you dial yourself back to the Iowa caucuses when Biden was on the far left, which meant he wasn't a player. You don't put the players out on the wings, right? Those guys are off the stage almost. They're behind the curtain almost. And then you had Harris, who got her ass kicked by Tulsi Gabbard and quit the next day. She quit the next day. So Harris got the same number of delegates that I got. And Biden was opposed to it. He was this old man who was supposed to bring adult supervision or something to the debates. If you had looked at I don't know if they existed, but if there was a pay line in Vegas for a Biden-Harris administration, it would have been 1,000 to 1. There was no chance those two would end up in the White House. And here we are. So we got the two biggest losers. We got the two biggest losers from the Iowa caucus. And how that happened. So in any event, last year I wrote about the fact that every administration looks horrible to the opponents. And if you look back, it's never as bad as the opponents think, and it seems to go forward. And so I wrote fairly favorably about how I thought that Biden would be the same. I am less forgiving now because I think what Biden's administration was called upon to do was to kind of bring stability and unity back. And so the U.S. right now is kind of like a country is analogous to like a married couple that's in marriage counseling. And every time one of them says something, the other one takes it personally and gets edgy, and no comment can be made that doesn't get personal. And you're in this vicious loop. And that's kind of where the country is. We're in this vicious loop where the Democrats and Republicans, just everything each party does, the other party hates, and you're neighbor against neighbor. And I thought Biden administration was being called upon to bring us back to earth a little bit on this. And their first, 6 months? I don't know, 4 months? First 4 months of their administration, it looks like they're attempting to do the most draconian political moves imaginable. The metaphor I like is they put their knee on the neck of the Republican Party, and it looks like they're trying to suffocate them, right? To use a timely metaphor. They're pushing every imaginable thermonuclear button politically. And I'm just staggered by that. I just thought they'd say, "Hey, let's see if we can work together and get this ship back pointed in the right direction." There's no evidence to me of all, and the idiocracy part, his inner circle, loosely defined, big inner circle, the people he appoints. They look like they're driven totally by the far left. So he looks like he's checking various boxes of racial and gender distribution. And there's not a lot of evidence that merit is at the top of the list. Not to say that these people aren't pretty good at what they do, but it really looks like he's box checking to me. And but they're doing so many things almost frantically, as though if they don't do them now, they'll never do it. And so the voting laws are pushing through ridiculous. Anyone who thinks you should be able to vote without an ID is out of their mind. I just can't fathom how that's a remotely rational concept. And if you're just not qualified to find a way to get an ID, I don't want you voting, right? It's that simple. But I sure as hell don't want people voting who just walk up and say, "Well, I'm a citizen and my name's John Smith." And I certainly don't want blanketing the countryside with empty ballots that can be scooped up and stuffed in boxes, like I think already happened. And so turning DC into the next state, stuffing the Supreme Court, everything smacks of destroy your opponent, as though this was a religious war. This feels like the Crusades to me. So it's not unifying at all. I can't forgive them if that's the path they stay on. I will not forgive them if they do that, because that's not what they had to do.
So do you think, what's going on with the Biden-Harris administration now, that some people are talking about, second American Civil War, and, now we're hearing this talk of the fall of the U.S. empire. So, how do you see where do we go from here? Are those, again, these apocalyptic scenarios that you're kind of dismissing, or how do you see us ending going forward?
Well, the problem is the Civil War model, which I've actually used. There's no Mason-Dixon line. There's no single issue that divides us. And so the Civil War, there's people from both teams in every state. And so I don't see how a Civil War plays out, even if we have one, but I can imagine a ramping up of the violence. We've certainly seen plenty of evidence of that. So I could imagine a lot of conflict. And to the extent that it starts looking like Rwanda or something, that would be a civil war. So that's a little scary. Probably not. That's not a high probability bet, but it's again, back to the divorcing couple. Two people who at one point got along pretty well are now at each other's throats pretty seriously. So,
given everything that we've kind of covered, what would be some advice for us, for young people today, even for old, key principles, tips to give us, in terms of preparing for, any difficult economic or political times ahead?
Actually, I give advice to, I get asked about advice for youngsters at several levels. One is about investing. I said, look, no matter what you do investing wise, just get in the habit of saving. So I don't even, I tell them, I said, look, I would probably just advise you to do a 60-40 portfolio. You're going to lose some of it at some point, in my opinion, but just get started. Don't lose your nerve. And if bonds get clobbered and stocks hold up, buy more bonds. If stocks get clobbered and bonds hold up, buy more stocks. Keep balancing it up, not through selling and buying, but through allocation. So if your bonds are light, allocate to bonds. When they ask me about some of the things that whip me into a frenzy, I tell them that if at their age, they're supposed to be trying to figure out how to build a career, start a family, change the world. I don't know how you do that if you think the system is broken. So at some level, I urge them to ignore all this and to just be optimistic and try to change the world independent of what my generation is doing to make it a mess. So these kids on college campuses who were burning their brain cells, protesting every grievance that they can fathom, while this is going on, they're not getting an education. And so I think it's getting in their way. My wife was at Cornell during the turbulent late 60s and early 70s, and she kind of squandered her education doing that, in my opinion. So my advice is ignore the adults. Don't worry about who's president. Don't worry about whether Biden and Harris are idiots or smart. Just get a good education. Don't study subjects that are of no value. Don't think just because you graduated from Cornell or someplace like that, just having that degree guarantees you a good job. It doesn't. You got to have marketable skills. So make sure you study stuff that's marketable.
A little bit of Jordan Peterson: make your bed, clean your room. Get that straight.
Exactly. That's why he's so popular, because it's life lessons.
Yeah. All right. You're on Twitter for now, and your interviews can be found all over the place if people just search your name. Any other website project we should know about?
No. David B. Collum on Twitter, and if you want to read some of the stuff I've written, you just search David Collum Year in Review, and I have the most poorly marketed blog in history, where I write once a year. That's not exactly the way to market a blog. But I at the end of every year, I write a summary of what I saw happening and whatever sort of crawled up my ass and bugged me. And it ends up being between, I'd say, 180, 200 pages. So I write a better part of a book at the end of every year. And it's to capture the events of the year as well as bring to fruition ideas that I've been working on sometimes for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And so it's a compendium of blogs brought into a coherent story. It's exceedingly irreverent. I think I'm a pretty good writer at this point. I think it's funny. It gets read by, I think, hundreds of thousands. I think it's popular. Larry Summers read it. How's that? There's a good one. Check one off for Secretary of Treasury. Hedge fund guys read it, as do soccer moms. So I've run into people all over the globe. I ran into a currency trader in Singapore who said, "Oh, you wrote that?" My Fidelity advisor didn't notice. He said, "Wait a minute, you wrote that?" I go, "Yeah, that was me. You want some advice?"
All right. Well,
that's it.
All right. People should definitely follow you on Twitter, Dave Collum. I love your commentary. It's very colorful on Twitter, and look for the interviews that he gives every week to popular podcast channels. And thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.